conversation. So over to you, David.
Thanks. Yes, thank you, Arete. I have titled this, If There Is Any Excellence, a conversation on virtue, a conversation on Arete. That, of course, is a quote from the Apostle Paul to the Philippians, and I can't help but use it because I had the pleasure of going to Philippi with Vedika years ago, and standing there amidst the rubble of that Byzantine provincial city where Paul also spent some time and also got himself imprisoned. So if there is any excellence, I'm going to do just a couple of things here. One is I want to talk about the issue of how it has come about that the language of values has become so ubiquitous within our culture and within churches. And to take note of the fact that as that happened, it really banished in many cases, the ancient language of virtue. I'll speak a little bit about what the language of values does, and then a little bit about the gifts of the language of virtues. So I'll begin with a set of questions. Are we called to duties and living up to the commandments, which we ought to do? Does the Christian spiritual life speak to us about who we are as created beings in our creatureliness and the kind of being that unfolds in our life, free of regimentation and restriction, calling forth the excellence that is within us? Is the church a school of duty? Is the church a community of the faithful, responding to the image and likeness of God found in all persons, in the depth of their fragility, in the depth of their disappointment and joy? Pathways opening to excellence in the person of Jesus Christ, the most excellent of human beings. Virtues are about the formation in the life of the spirit. They're not about moral perfection. I like to think of virtue the way I was taught, actually, by my father, I suppose, initially, who was a carpenter and figured out how to glue oak together. I think of it in its sort of third meaning in the dictionary. When we think of a Ming vase, an ancient Chinese vase that is considered virtuous, a virtuous object. A virtuous object is not a perfect object. That is, virtuous objects have lasted a long time. They have cracks and sometimes chips in them. But the way they were made was an excellent coming together of material and form and purpose. And then they were used properly. And so they get passed on as objects of beauty. There are some kind of foundational presuppositions that I have around this theme. And the first one, of course, is that out of the heart of the Orthodox tradition, out of the heart of the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition, human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. Our nature is good. And even our missteps are expressions of the possibility of turning toward wholeness, even if it's just beyond our reach, of turning toward God. Our God-given desires are deeply good. Our appetites are problematic. And only when these beautiful and good desires become detached from who we are and attached to an image of who we are they despoiled, and is our life despoiled. Secondly, in the teaching of the fathers and mothers of the church on the spiritual life, our nature in the image of God is not closed. It is not complete or frozen, but rather out of our nature and because of our nature and the free will we have, which is at its center, we are beings that are always becoming. We are always moving towards, or called to move towards, the likeness of God. We are, as the ancients put it, in statu viatoris, in the state of being on the way. We are always in the midst of our experience of creatureliness, and yet we really exist. Our fulfillment is coming to greet us from the future. A new moment of becoming. A new life is unfolding. The language of virtues, or the language of values. Let me say a little bit about this. My friend Ian Benson, who teaches in Sydney, Australia, has written an essay on values language, which he calls A Cuckoo's Egg, or Useful Moral Framework. So Ian teaches law and philosophy in Sydney, and he has been involved in many court cases before the Supreme Court of Canada and other places, associated, usually brought by religious folks that are concerned about some issues related to human rights and how they're being limited by this. But I think he has a couple of interesting things to say here about the language of virtues that's emerged. Values language came forward in our culture with the rise of capitalism and the modern reduction of human beings to instruments of production. This was a new doctrine of what it means to be human, implied by both capitalism and communism and other forms of modern humanism, grounded in the simplicity of human psychology and the easy division, and leads to the easy division into those that are good and those that are evil. It has in it the notion that life's meaning is already known. And it really is a reduction of ethics to politics. Values language captured the political and religious right, and it captured the political and religious left. It captured conservatives and progressives alike. Values language laid its egg, nested in the church as well. And it is the cuckoo's egg, as my friend Ian Benson calls it. The cuckoo lays its egg in the nest of another bird. That bird mistakes it for its own. When it hatches, its first act is to push out the others, the other fledglings, usually to their death, and it remains the only mouth to be fed by the mother. Values language is a cuckoo's egg that was laid in the nest of the church. So what characterizes this language of values? The term values is purely subjective. It's lacking the rich frame of thinking about virtue that stretches back to the very foundations of Western civilization. and is thought about in many and varied textures ways in the Christian tradition. Values are personal assertions of the will of a person or a group. So we have Christian values, we have family values, corporate values, Canadian values. And we often take refuge these days in our common discourse. We take refuge in the notion that you have your values and I have mine. And that pretty much ends any conversation and any thinking. Values language colonizes our thinking about the moral life. It imprisons this thinking in our ideological interests, and it unhinges. It's interesting to remember that the word hinge is one of the meanings of the Greek word for virtue, for arete. That was understood as a hinge. The values language unhinges us and isolates our consideration of behavior from being. From being. It unhinges what we think of the moral life. It unhinges it from being. And that is why we can so easily see some persons who do not share our values as evil, and others who do share them as good. It's interesting to me that Pope John Paul II, the Polish Pope, that he wrote his doctoral dissertation, which was really a theology of the body. And I think whatever else he'll be remembered for within the Catholic tradition, he will be remembered for this work because he's the first one in close to 500 years who tried to restore to Catholic thought the notion of the moral life as being essentially grounded in ontology, grounded in the question of being. What had happened in Catholic thought is that unhinging had taken place. And as a result, Catholicism developed moral theology, something that was not developed in the Christian East. It developed moral theology as a separate kind of discipline, but a separate discipline, again, unhinged from the question of being. Within the context of the church, this is particularly odd, and it seems to me problematic. It makes into the community of the faithful a moral and ideological fraternity. It creates, in a sense, the devil's church, which is the opposite of ecclesia, the opposite of that gathering through grace, that gathering in wonder and praise for what is growing in our communion with each other. It removes the regard for others as the image and likeness of God and replaces the stance that arises from such an understanding with a kind of throne of righteous judgment that turns life into a contest between opposing parties. It banishes our ability to listen in silence to the heart of others and hear their fragile and wounded heart, knowing that there too something is struggling to be born, something is at work, is seeking, is trying to find its way through the dark and through ignorance, seeking light and a life without fear and desire, a condition Christians claim to have known at one time in their own life and to have been rescued from. So it's most curious to me how this language for many very good Christians, good people who themselves have experienced salvation, they speak about how Jesus Christ rescued them, then get captured by this language And instead of this deepening their sense of solidarity and compassion, it elevates their sense of righteousness. Attentiveness and presence to the other is replaced by presumption and certainty. And presumption and certainty are the seminal conditions of bad faith. Values language is particularly harmful, of course, when it becomes the preoccupation for the spiritual formation of the young, of our children. It means that their behavior then drops into the center, and their being, we are blind to their being. Their unfolding, the unfolding making of their soul with all the struggles and challenges of life is set aside. A regard and attentiveness to their being as it is unfolding. To their self-understanding as it is unfolding. To their sense of meaning and purpose as it is unfolding is set aside. And when this happens, we are in the danger of perpetuating a kind of deep moral injury, an assault on their being that does little more than deepen their fledgling sense of belonging to what is greater than their immediate passions. And worst of all, it can take root and become the language that gives no room for understanding what the Apostle Paul has said when he talks about himself and his own spiritual condition. What I do, I would not. What I would, I do not. Paul is a model here for us. That struggle is central to our being, central to the unfolding of our becoming. It is not the place where the litmus test of moral absolutes should be assigned. George Grant, our eminent Canadian philosopher, understood that values is an obscuring language for morality, used when the idea of purpose has been destroyed. So think of that. Values is an obscuring language used when the very notions of purpose has been destroyed. Everyone uses the word values to describe how making the world, not how we receive the world, not how we become deeper present to the world, not about our common making of the world through communion. So capitalists and socialists, atheists and avowed believers scientists, politicians, church leaders, this language of values has become central to the kind of ideological silos that now have captured our discourse so often. So values education is a kind of schooling in an ideology. It may be good or not, but good or not, it is nevertheless an ideological education. It cuts off moral education at its core because it separates it from being and becoming. Earlier language of virtue draws on a tradition offering more than personal choice. It's offering a framework that itself holds together our limitations and missteps, holds them gently in an understanding that we are on the way. And whatever mistakes we make, offers us, depending on our response to them, an opportunity to an enlarged sense of who we are and what life how life may become. It does this because there are no personal virtues. Virtues flourish in communion and through experience. They flourish in the dynamism of our becoming and of our being made new. Let me just say a wee little bit about virtue, and then we can talk together. What really is virtue? Well, I began by mentioning that I prefer the sort of third definition of virtue. I find it the most illuminating when we speak of a virtuous object. That is a Ming vase, which has been handed down, or my grandmother's bread bowl, in which she made bread every 3 days, and my mother inherited it, and she made bread every 2 days, and I loved that bread. And that bowl made of clay is a blessed bowl. The relationship between blessing and virtue, I think, is so intimate. It is a blessed bowl, not because it looks the way it looked when it came off the potter's wheel, but because it has been used with tenderness and joy in a proper way. And it has given life and nourishment. And so the cracks in it, the chips in it, all speak. They all speak of the gift of fragile and wondrous life. So virtue, in its basic sense, arete, lovely Greek word, means power. That's interesting. Not force. Power, and the opposite of power is force. Or excellence, a settled attitude, inclining one to habitually good action. Various classifications, such as the intellectual virtues, wisdom, for example, are associated with the contemplative life, and practical virtues, such as courage, are associated with the active life. And the cardinal virtues are distinguished in our tradition from the theological virtues. The natural virtues are distinguished from those attained only through God's working in us. So what is virtue? A settled disposition acquired by practice or given by grace. To act, to feel, to think in ways that are appropriate for the goodness of life, not in ways that are appropriate for me getting my way or for my understanding of righteousness, but in ways that are appropriate for the unfolding of the goodness of life. And the center of the goodness of life is communion within our tradition. If something is not nurturing communion, what is it? Well, it's the work of the rumor monger. It's the work of the deceiver. It's the work of alienation. And what is the good life? Well, the good life, we often speak about it, read about it in the church fathers and mothers as friendship with God. And friendship with God, at the heart of that are what our tradition calls the theological virtues: faith, hope, charity. And it's important to remember that faith is not belief. Faith is a disposition. It is this kind of stance which is open, attentive, regarding what is unfolding in communion. Hope is not some kind of fantasy about life after death. Hope is a disposition toward what is coming to greet us, toward the future. And charity, of course, is not good deeds. It is a disposition, an inclination to respond in love for the other, as opposed to self-love. The other principles of virtue that have to do with friendship with God, and through our friendship with God with others, we call the cardinal virtues. Cardinal is also a nice word that has the echo of the word hinge in it. And the cardinal virtues are understood to be those virtues that we can cultivate. They can be cultivated through education, cultivated through conversation, through a deepening sense of self-understanding. The theological virtues are gifts from God. They're just there: faith, hope, charity. We can't cultivate them. They are part of our created being. They're central to our created being. The cardinal virtues, however, can be cultivated, and then they're linked, of course, intimately to the theological virtues. But the cardinal virtues are justice. And think of this for a moment, the way in which justice as a value has been reduced to a value by progressives, by conservatives. The cardinal virtues are justice, courage, temperance, and good sense, prudence. So they require some work and some effort, and are part of the spiritual formation of human beings. But of course, they're cultivated. They don't exist in some complete form, but they can be cultivated. And of course, we understand that when these are cultivated in a human being's orientation to life, their stance is that of one open to, attentive to, present in communion. Not with the perfect, but in communion, just like that bread bowl of my grandmother. In communion, attentive, present to that which is bringing about the goodness of life, with all of its wounds, with all of its chips and scars, and with all of its brokenness, in fact. So, just to finish, we need to remember that any virtue, we can reduce faith to belief. We can reduce hope to presumption. We can reduce charity alas to hatred. And the same with the cardinal virtues. When we see them as abstractions, when we dress them up in ideological garments, when we have litmus tests around them, then we, of course, are no longer in situ viatoris. We are no longer people on the way. living present to the unfolding of the kingdom that is coming to greet us. The ancient philosophers and the church fathers and many other great souls in many cultures, many times and places, focused on the training in virtue because they knew that we as human beings need to learn something about the nature of the world, that the world is a place where there is suffering, where there is temptation, where there is imbalance and misstep. And so being able to live with that, being able to engage suffering and not be colonized by it, being able to understand when temptation crosses our path. But to hear in it our own inner suffering. The ability to witness imbalance and then seek to set it right, to bring things back into balance again. The whole meaning of righteousness, it seems to me. Those were understood as so important in the training of the young, in the education of the young, not for their own sake, not for the sake even of their personal salvation, but for the sake of the life of the world, because the world is a fragile and wondrous place. So let me just finish with that little reminder from our old friend Gregory of Nyssa. I named one of my sons for him, so I got a pretty special relationship to him. And I've spent a fair bit of time in Cappadocia, in Nevşehir, which is Nyssa, which is his home. I walk in his footsteps a little bit. Gregory of Nyssa says to us that the goal of the virtuous life is to become like God. And what is God like? Well, we have the Gospels. He is the one who is present without litmus test, without desire, simply present to the heart of everyone he meets. And through that presence, they are able to speak their deep sorrow and suffering and joy and come to a fuller sense of life. What is that God like? He hung on a tree instead of passing on the suffering. He was present even in his last breath, holding together desolation and openness to what is unfolding. Virtues and values are not in the same world. C'est ça.
Thank you, David. I'm going to ask Eden, who's joined us today, to maybe be the first respondent, and then Vladika. So over to you, Eden.
I hope that this segues into what you were talking about, David. What it's bringing up for me is when I'm hearing someone referring to my truth. And I find that curious and somewhat uncomfortable to hear. and I'm left with a lot of questions usually. And I have questions like, is it truth or is it your experience? And is it truth or your version of an event? Is it truth or your opinion? Is it the truth or something or the truth being something that transcends circumstances? Or is it a rendering of a narrative that is steeped in judgment? So some of the places I land with that, but I'll just toss them out there in case I've missed stuff and you guys have other thoughts. The truth is not meant to be something ambiguous or that, you know, is on shifting sand at all times. Truth needs to be like grounded in a clear-eyed and honest understanding of how we will respond and observe things that happen around us. It kind of has to be something that's predetermined in us. And I think when I hear the words, my truth, I kind of feel like now suddenly truth is being used as a weapon, but that it's actually meant to be like a personal plumb line on how we will participate in things that happen around us. I may have a version of something that happened, but if I call it my truth, then that seems to me to narrow others' ability to share their version or their intentions or their motives. And I don't think that's what truth is meant to be. It makes me think of a little story. My sister, Alice, was born and within a day or two of her being born, she needed an entire blood transfusion because she had no iron in her blood. And it was, I mean, this was 1960. It wasn't just a run-of-the-mill sort of thing to do to a one-day-old infant. And so there was some concern about it. There happened to be a great uncle in the same hospital as my sister was for this. And he was on his deathbed, but lingering. And he suggested, what he actually suggested was that he would choose to die so that she could live if that was possible. But somehow in the way that this was expressed, my sister understood that he somehow had wished her to die. And she lived with that well into her adulthood, feeling like these words had been a curse on her. And it really harmed her. And it was her truth, but it wasn't the truth. And when that was finally established, when she shared the confusion over that as an adult with my parents, and they cleared up what the actual truth was, it made a profound difference for my sister. And I think when our own truth gives no space for others to speak further truth or the truth, we have cornered ourselves. And I don't think my truth would be helpful in that state.
Thanks, Eden. Let's bring in Vladika now. If you can hit unmute, Vladika, and I'll pin you here so we can.
Brad,
yeah,
I want to respond a little bit to Eden.
Okay.
Yeah. My sense, Eden, is that when people say, this is my truth, this is just a polite way of saying, go to hell.
Yep.
And this is pretty ubiquitous in our society. Also, when we say, well, that's my experience, that is also a polite way of saying, go to hell. And that's part of our modern, that's what's happened within our society, because we've really lost the feel for the transcendent. A second thing I would say is that, and this may be, maybe this will set the cat among the pigeons. Christianity doesn't care about the truth. That is, truth as it was understood by philosophers. It's not that that's not worth considering, it sure is. So don't get me wrong. What did Plato and Aristotle understand it to be? But let's remember Socrates, their teacher. And what was he doing with this? He understood that the kind of category truth is a precious category, just like the category God is a precious category, but both of them are empty. And they better be empty. They better be precious and treasured, but empty. And that's why we read in the gospel, Jesus Christ saying, I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. And that, of course, is a quote from the book of Genesis, when Moses goes behind the mountain to get his vocation and has his conversation with Adonai, blessed be he, and asks who Adonai was. And Adonai says, I am. That is a way of speaking about that the only truth we know anything about, we can know anything about, is a form of presence in communion. And abstract truths are not the purview of the Christian tradition. We're not engaged in pissing contests about whose truth is better than somebody else's. So there's a long history of what's happened to this word, this very precious word, but word that must be empty. Because as you know, certainly better than I, truth is a person. Truth is personhood. Truth is encounter. Truth is presence. Presence which is in communion. And so the real question here is, what do you do pastorally with this? And because I think it is also a confession. It's a confession which is saying, I'm sorry. I'm crawling into a hole. I'm crawling into a hole of my own making. So instead of getting angry about it, which I might be inclined to do, or make some argument about it, we need to hear the heart of the person here. And they're crawling into a hole. This is the way of cutting off communion. And so it is a classic example of what we mean precisely by Antichrist. It may appear to be virtuous or righteous or moral, but it is exactly the opposite. It is saying, I no longer have any time or space for you. It's a tragedy. Does that make any sense?
Very good. Vladika,
Yeah,
would you like to respond now or share your heart about this stuff?
I was interested in the subject, just like morality and moralism, because virtue is an aspiration, and the language of values is an ideology. a fixed ideology, and it defines us politically more than it does spiritually. It doesn't really speak to a spiritual life. It's like, morality becomes a heresy when it's a substitute for a life in Christ. And the language of values is the catafalque of aspirations. That virtue is something that draws aspirations, and values are something that closes them off in a box and proclaims the truth of some ideologue or some document. And Canadian values, what are Canadian values? The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, universal health care, the social safety net. And so we have a system of values. And if they start overlapping with religious aspirations, then they put us in a box and they become our truths, which everybody must abide by, or else they're evil. And but they don't aspire to anything. They don't draw anything spiritual out of us. They freeze us into sort of a system of bowling pins sitting at the end of the bowling alley. And it's a tragedy of locking ourselves into a value system. But it really doesn't have any aspirations. It just has conformity. And it doesn't have any idea of seeking the truth. It has the idea of dictating the truth. And the truth is some ideology, strictly ideology. Pontius Pilate wasn't being curious when he said, "What is truth?" He was saying it, sarcastically. Well, what is truth? And we can say the same. What is truth? If Jesus Christ isn't the only truth, everything else is sort of malleable or subjective. I mean, I hear this every Thursday night in the Narcotics Anonymous meeting. One person's truth is not the other person's truth. Because people don't encounter life in the same way. They don't encounter pain in the same way. It comes from different sources. They don't encounter tragedies in the same way. So one person's truth is really defines a path, and it doesn't define an ultimate conclusion, because only Jesus is truth, and everything else is relative to the person experiencing it. That you can't, so you can't say my truth as opposed to your truth, because they can't be opposed to each other. We can't set my truth in opposition to your truth. Otherwise, we're writing you off. We're saying, well, this is a moralism. See, my truth, but your truth is immoral, because your truth sets you on an immoral course. And that's the whole thing. That virtues is aspiration, and values is a box, an ideology, an insistence that everybody accept our truth or my truth, but you don't have any aspirations of your own toward anything higher. Values can't lift you up, and they can't give you aspirations. They can't give you spiritual ascent. And they can't heal your alienation from anyone else. All they are is a conformity, a rule of conformity. And conformity isn't spiritual life.
Yeah.
Conformity has no spiritual value. It's, being in communion isn't being in conformity.
It's the opposite.
It's the opposite, yeah. Because being in communion means that, if you go into the sweet mystery of the parish is there, where we get to work out the possibility of unselfish love and of acceptance of everyone as they are, and becoming in communion with people who are totally different from us, even speak different languages from us. And that values can do absolutely nothing but crush you into a box. And they can't give you any kind of spiritual growth. They can only stunt your growth and bring you down. But the whole idea of virtues, I mean, the virtue of a knife is its sharpness. So you're aspiring to perfect yourself in the virtues, because virtues require you to ascend towards something else. And that's.
They're always a time of growth.
Well, I want to, sometimes I think of Abelard, intentionality and attitude are a definite part of virtue and morality, because that idea that you just conform, that's what morality is, conformity. That's what values are, it's conformity. And it's pressing you in so that we can't allow that anyone who has a different worldview from us, anyone who has different aspirations or different ideas or concepts, they're obviously a little bit iffy, maybe evil, maybe a threat. And so we can't really open ourselves to them at all. We just close ourselves off, close the door. I mean, these are our values. Well, who says they're our values? These are American values. These are Canadian values. I mean, what does that mean? If our values are freedom, individualism, then how come we persecute people, individuals who are different from us, people who want freedom equal with ours, even though they're different from us? So that pays the fraudulence of what are American values. American values are freedom, individualism, and liberties, civil liberties, but not for the people who don't think the way I do. That's the problem with value systems. It's also the problem with the idea of truth. I mean, let's go back to Pontius Pilate. What is truth? If truth isn't, the only truth is Jesus Christ. But other things, people have understandings of things that become, what they think is true. It's nice if people are open to have their attitudes change, their ideas change. You freeze yourself into this is my truth. You can't have a conversation with anybody, really. So anyway, that's I just want to say that values is aspiration, and the virtue is aspiration, and values systems are the catapult of aspirations. So.
Thank you, Vladika. Now we have about 5 minutes left here. I'm wondering if any of our guests would like to jump in with a question and comment. The Pattons, or hi, Joan, welcome.
Jody always
unmute yourself.
Jody always has opinions.
Don't forget to unmute, Joan. Okay. Now, luckily, we finally got to meet you, and I'm so grateful for that. So, but you're still on mute. We have to unmute you. So I've asked.
You're muted, Jody.
Give her directions.
We can hear you now.
You know what? I may have clicked mute again just as she unmuted. So I'll move my hands away from the screen and you do it again. Unmute.
Still can't hear me.
Now we can. Oh, now you disappeared again. So unmute one more time. There you go.
No,
your finger is double clicking.
Single click.
One more time. There. Good.
But
We can hear you just fine now.
all right, I have to hold it down, I think. I apologize to both Brad and David for my short emails that I thought I'd screwed up or I didn't have the password correctly, but then I realized I had to separate the numbers at the end from the other. And once I did that, so apologies, David, because I really thought I'd interpreted it incorrect.
You just said down here, and I had no idea. I thought you were the devil. I didn't know who it was.
I possibly could be at times. Oh dear. It's wonderful to be with you all. Oh golly, I so enjoyed meeting Brad and Eden in Albuquerque, of all places. It was wonderful, and it was very well attended. I was very impressed with the enthusiasm of the young people there. It was great to see. Very open and very joyous about being there and welcoming David and Eden and the other speakers. I was only there one day, but I did report to Vladika.
Yes, of course.
God bless him. What your office looks exactly as I recall it years ago. 2000. My goodness. Well, it's an excellent conversation. It definitely dovetails with the values and virtue essay that Vladika sent me, what, 2 years ago, Vladika, maybe? And we worked on. So a lot to it. I'm still in the learning stage. I think we all are. It's not easy journeying through the life we're facing right now. We need all the help we can get. Do I unmute now? Do I take my finger off?
Yeah. You're muted.
And the Pattons, we want to give you an opportunity to say a word.
Yeah, we just wanted to say thanks. This is the first time we've had the opportunity to join one of your discussions, and we learned a lot to contemplate, and really appreciate getting to meet all of you here through the video.
Thank you, Sybil. So David, any closing words as we part? I guess you get to do, as the presenter, you get to do the benediction of sorts.
I don't have any benediction, but I do have an issue that I think deserves at least a little bit of attention.
Okay.
I think of the gift of human rights, one of the greatest gifts, I think, of the 20th century, because what it did was, or what it can do, is it can temper the divine right of the majority. So it's a very important matter. But I do think that human rights is a value. It's a civil value. And it's not that values aren't important. Values are very important, but they're not what is at the center of the Christian life. You do not have a Christian life, obviously, or any kind of a life, if you imagine yourself outside the framework of all values. But my sense is that within our public discourse, we are so sloppy in the way in which we go about that. And Christians across the board, as sloppy as anybody, that we tend to elevate our understanding of human rights, for example. We tend to elevate them and then use them over against other people as well. So my sense is that human rights, this great gift of the last century to us, is one of the great value statements that civil life gives us. But it's in the civil sphere and needs to do its work there in the civil sphere. But it is, if we use that as a kind of simulacrum to replace the work of the spiritual life, the work in growing in holiness, growing in a way that inclines us to deeper community, to deeper communion across deep difference, then of course we need to have both of these that are active within us and within our thinking.
Well, thanks, David. That flew by. We look forward to meeting again soon, and we will send out an invitation as soon as we've set a date for that. And we appreciate that you would all pop in, but that's about an hour's worth of gold to meditate on for the next few days. So, well, and beyond. I will be posting the recording of this to Clarion Journal, and we'll send a link out, and you'll be able to review what was said, because it seems to me there's a lot to think through there, and to internalize from what David presented and our respondent. So blessings on you all. I'll end the meeting now. Thank you.